Nvidia has been dominating the AI GPU market over the past couple of years. Currently in 2024, they managed to sell 100 billion or so in AI GPUs. Of those 100 billion, roughly 15 billion came from the networking of the GPUs, i.e. how do you communicate between your GPUs? Remember, these clusters are in the range of, currently hundreds of thousands. The largest one that we know of is a XAI Colossus, Elon Musk's Colossus, that is currently having 200,000 AI GPUs connected to each other. And that connection part is very important because you might have a competitive chip to Nvidia. In fact, AMD has a very competitive chip already, MI300. You could argue it's on a single chip basis much better than Nvidia's H100 and H200. AMD's memory capacity at 192 gigabytes compared to H100 and H200 is, substantially larger. The main competitor for AMD, the Blackwell that recently was launched, is having the same amount of memory capacity, but that is like a year later after MI300 launched. And soon, in a couple of weeks or months, AMD will also launch MI350X, which will have essentially 100 gigabytes more memory capacity on a single chip basis. But then again, the big problem for AMD is the interconnection between all of these GPUs. And I would say that Nvidia has a huge advantage in that regard, and that is probably one of the main reasons why Nvidia still has such a huge domination in that market. MI300 is the fastest ramping AMD chip of all time. That is despite AMD being like 60 or 70 years old company. So that says quite a lot. And despite that, AMD is still not competitive with Nvidia currently. Now, for AMD, 5 billion of 2024 sales is quite good, I would say. This year has been a little bit of a disappointing due to the fact that, we are currently between the launch of MI355X and MI300 being a little bit now, old. It's not more than 18 months old, but it's quite a lot for this kind of market. And there's been another product, MI325X, in that, time frame over the past, let's say, 4 or 5 months. But MI325X hasn't been getting quite a lot of traction because essentially it's the same chip, a little bit, updated with higher memory capacity. But that much higher memory capacity, we can see that MI325X now, it's coming with like 50 or 60 gigabytes more memory capacity. 256 gigabyte compared to 192. But the problem again is in the interconnect, and AMD is working on interconnect together with a broad set of other companies like Broadcom, Intel, Microsoft, Amazon, and so on in a UA-Link consortium competing against Nvidia. But that is still yet to be seen. Like Nvidia still has the advantage in the large clusters, which is why I would say that AMD has not seen any kind of large wins compared to the XAI. In the 50 to 100,000 units in a single cluster. The largest known cluster of AMD currently on MI300 is Oracle's 16,000 or so MI300 GPUs. Oracle, of which also just recently announced they're going to have another one with 30,000 MI355Xs. So that's going to probably be late 2025, early 2026 at the time frame when that cluster is going to be online. We also know that other than Oracle, there are a couple of other companies that are larger customers of AMD's MI300 chips in 2024. Microsoft, obviously, and Meta. Now, the reason why I didn't mention them first is because the largest single cluster seems to be from Oracle, but combined, divided across multiple clusters, I think Meta and Microsoft have substantially more MI300s. In regards to Meta, it's actually quite interesting. You can see that according to this article, the register, last year they bought around 170,000 MI300s, and Meta also bought 225,000 from Nvidia. So Meta is actually purchasing the same amount of AMD chips as Nvidia chips, or almost the same amount. Nvidia still sells 50,000 more, but it's in the same ballpark. Whereas obviously Microsoft bought almost 500,000 H100s or so from Nvidia last year, and they only bought around 100,000 AMD. But still for AMD, I would say it was a really good 2024. Going to, the chit chatter on Twitter, I think there's a lot of people that are expecting AMD to gain 10-20% market share from Nvidia. And it's also been a long-term target for me, but I'm expecting, again, first half of 2025 to be quite easy for AMD's AI data center sales due to the, this between period between the new chip and the old MI300 chip. But as we go into the second half of this year, I do expect that AMD will have much larger sales, and we still see like an increased sales trajectory. And you can see that the blue bars there, which is AMD's total revenue, I'm expecting them to break around 10 billion already in Q3, at the latest in Q4. AMD has a very strong, business. They are quite diversified in terms of the embedded line, which is the legacy Xilinx FPGAs. Then you also had the gaming and the client. The gaming CPUs, GPUs, the consoles like PlayStation 5, PlayStation 5 Pro and Xbox and so on. The handhelds also recently. And then obviously data centers. So I would say that AMD is quite diversified. They seem to have quite nice control over their R&D and marketing budget. They don't have a whole lot of stock-based compensation compared to a lot of other companies. So my point of view when it comes to AMD is that we are on the cusp of a huge increase in earnings per share. This could be a little bit too aggressive. It's difficult to say, but based on this previous chart here, especially Q3 and Q4, I'm assuming huge increase on MI355X sales. So the data center sales would go up quite substantially. Also the EPYC, the red ones, which is the CPU servers, they're still gaining market share from Intel, and that's going up slower but steadily. So when it comes to AMD, I would say that we are very close to an explosive phase up where their earnings per share is going to go up. And this you can also see in my modeling for AMD in 2025. Q1 of 2025, I assume roughly 1.8 to 1.9 million from AI GPUs. Q2 around 2 billion. I would argue that number is a little bit too high most likely. Maybe it could be again 1.6 to 1.9, somewhere there. But Q3 and Q4, I'm expecting quite substantial increase. You could argue that 3.6 and 4.5 is quite a lot. We could reduce that number to, let's say, on average 3 billion Q3 and 4 billion in Q4, which reduces our total number for full year from 12 billion to around 10 billion. But that is my expectations for this year. MI355X is much more competitive. They're also competing against Blackwell, not only like in the FP8, but also in FP4. And remember that if you follow in this channel, you know that the lower you go in the floating point, FP stands for floating point, I think. And you have floating point 32, which is high precision for scientific calculations. And in AI calculations, you don't need that amount of precision. You just need like high throughput. So you need many more calculations with a little bit reduce of, precision. And that is what, floating point going from 32, 16, 8 to 4 means. You reduce your precision, but you increase your amount of number of calculated, essentially equations or matrices. And they are doing that in the same amount of output as Nvidia's Blackwell. Both of them are currently sitting at around 9,000 or so teraflops at FP4 and 4,500 in FP8. So I'm quite confident with AMD's single chip design, but the problem for AMD has to be the interconnect, like the connection between all these chips. And if they manage to have a nice solution for that, they could also start to gain a few of these like huge cluster gains. Imagine if AMD announces like a 50 to 100,000 cluster from a single company, be it Amazon or Microsoft or Meta or whoever it might be. We are currently again aware of the Oracle sale of around 30,000 MI355Xs, and something is telling me that deal is probably not the biggest one. Within this year, I would expect that AMD announces at least one or two other clusters that are larger than the Oracle one. So that is my probably, is AMD going to be a $1 trillion, the next $1 trillion US company, especially on the semiconductor space? Currently, the market cap is at around 180 billion, well off from the likes of Broadcom and Nvidia. Nvidia is like 15 times larger than AMD currently, maybe 20 times larger. But I do believe that long term, AMD will gain market share from Nvidia, and Nvidia will have to either reduce their margins, or in best case scenario, they don't decrease their average sales prices, and AMD just eats into at least the market share in terms of number of sold chips. And that is why I expect that in the couple of years ahead, AMD will be much more profitable, because there is no stopping this AI trend. A couple of years ago, I expected that it was kind of a little bit of a hype, but with the executions, I mean, the stuff that these AI models can do, ChatGPT, Grok, Gemini 2.5, some of the stuff that can do is like utterly insane. And then you think about it, how far they have come already in a couple of years. Imagine what they can do in 3 or 4 years from now. So I'm not expecting any slowdown whatsoever. Even if Nvidia continues at 80 to 90% market share, the actual market size is gonna increase by 2, 3, 4x time in 5, 6 years. So AMD is gonna still be able to get some huge wins for their Instinct AI GPUs. And based on that, I just feel like the current valuation is quite low. I mean, the price target is now already coming down so fast, but still the price of $200 which is the highest target currently, I do believe that is from Mr. Hans Mosesman, which is probably the most accurate AMD analyst out there, and that is a quite good sign. I mean, the stock price is currently at $110, and now I'm expecting earnings per share of, I mean, at least $1 at the very least from Q3 onwards every single quarter, and probably somewhere next year we're gonna see $2 or $3 earnings per share on a quarterly basis if everything goes well. That is like severely undervalued company with the current stock price sitting at around $110. I mean, they could easily bring in $5, $6, $7 earnings per share on annual run rate already from next year. That is a PE ratio of what, 15? So I would say that in addition to all the other segments that AMD are like executing so well, remember, I mean, look at the earnings, you can see that data center was very good, but the client and the gaming is also up. I mean, 28% year over year. They're eating into Intel's market share, and the embedded is a little bit struggling. It's been struggling over the past couple of years, but I do say we are still getting, 800, 900, a healthy maybe 1 billion in a couple of quarters time from embedded with high margins. I mean, their operating income from that 800 million is 300 million, so that's quite a high margin revenue. So I'm not worried at all when it comes to AMD, and that was just a quick update on where I see the company currently. And I do think that many of you are correct that AMD is, if there's any competitor out there to Nvidia, it has to be AMD, based on the facts that we have currently having. So please like, subscribe, comment in the comment section. Do you believe that AMD will at least gain, from the current 4 or 5% market share to 10, 15% 3 years from now? And see you in the next one.